Okay, so welcome to this afternoon session. It's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Professor Ulrike Hahn, who is the director of the Center for Cognition, Computation and Modeling at Birkbeck, University of London. She received several honors and awards which reflect her rich and robust contribution to psychology, cognitive science and argumentation theory, including Computational Modeling Prize in 2018 and the Honorary Doctorate of Lund University in 2017. Ulrike's research focuses on human judgment, decision-making and the rationality of arguments, but she's also keen on studying language and social networks. Today, she's going to talk on how we track the normative standards of argument quality in real-world argumentation. Since there has been some technical issues with internet connection at Professor Hahn's place, I will play the video presentation record first, then our colleague Jonas Raab will comment on the presentation, and then Professor Hahn will connect our discussion via cell phone connection. Okay, so Ulrike, I will share my screen. So let's begin.
Hi, I want to talk to you today about norms for real-world argumentation. That is, norms for measuring whether an argument is good or bad. Now, historically, uncontroversially, the bedrock of argument is logic.
Lukáš, asi si zapni mikrofón, nie je počuť.
Examples of a catalog of 20 to 30 fallacies, depending on how you count. And the key question historically is, why are they bad? Intuitively, they're bad, but we want an explanatory account that tells us exactly why they are bad. And historically, such an explanation has been hard to come by.
Sorry, I muted my microphone, so let me replay it at least, yes, from here. Okay.
Now, historically, uncontroversially, the bedrock of argument is logic. And though logic is incredibly powerful, construct all of mathematics with just logic and set theory, its traction in the context of real-world argument is unfortunately rather limited. And that's nowhere more apparent than in the so-called fallacies of argumentation. Fallacies are arguments that might seem convincing, but are nevertheless weak. There's traps for unwary reasoners. Best illustrated with examples such as circular arguments. God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is the word of God. The argument from ignorance, ghosts exist because nobody's proven that they don't. Slippery slope arguments, if we legalize gay marriage, next thing people will want to marry their pets. These are all examples of a catalog of 20 to 30 fallacies, depending on how you count. And the key question historically is, why are they bad? Intuitively, they're bad, but we want an explanatory account that tells us exactly why they are bad. And historically, such an explanation has been hard to come by. For a long time, presumably, the failure to find such an explanation was due to the use of simply the wrong tool. classical logic has nothing to say about most of the fallacies, as is well known ever since Hamblin, the very latest. And before you find yourself going down the path of wanting to say, well, that's why they're fallacies, because they're logically valid, not valid, it's important to point out that some of the fallacies, such as circular arguments, are logically valid arguments. God exists because God exists is a logically valid argument, but it's nevertheless a poor way of trying to convince somebody of the existence of God. So at the very least, logical validity and this kind of intuitive argument strength that the fallacies are appealing to dissociate. The second problem with respect to the fallacies for any purely structural account is that many of the fallacies have exceptions that have the same logical structure, but don't seem quite as bad. So the specific content matters, not just the form. So we might think about arguments from ignorance again, and realize that saying something like, this vaccine is safe because no side effects have been observed in clinical trials is an argument from ignorance, but one that we're actually staking our actual behavior on. So what makes that example acceptable and the ghosts example poor? What exactly is going on there? We need an account that allows us to distinguish that. And because content matters and not just the structure of the argument, it's also the case that more recent attempts to explain the fallacies by appealing to the wider discourse, to the dialectical structure or context in which arguments appear, it's why those kinds of attempts also fail. So it's been said, for example, that an argument from ignorance is a fallacy because you're failing to discharge your burden of proof, or it's an inappropriate attempt to shift the burden of proof. The underlying idea being here that in order to understand the fallacies, we have to understand them as arguments that are being provided in a wider dialectical context, not just as arguments in isolation. That, of course, already sits slightly uneasily with the fact that even when I gave you these things in isolation, they seemed poor without a dialectical context. But I can also show that adding a dialectical context doesn't fix the issue, right? So imagine the following dialogue. Harry says, ghosts exist. Sally says, what reason can you offer for believing this? Harry says, nobody's proven that they don't. Now, this is an argument from ignorance. It's the same argument as before. So if this is to be explained by Harry failing to discharge his burden of proof, then we have the following puzzle, right? Harry is offering a reason. He's been asked to support the claim he made. He's offered a reason. So if despite offering this reason, he's failing to meet his burden of proof, that can only be because the actual content of his evidence or what his argument is weak, right? But of course, that presupposes the very thing we're trying to explain. So really, failure with respect to burden of proof is a consequence, not a cause. You fail to meet your burden of proof because you provide a poor argument. It's not that the argument is poor because you fail to meet your burden of proof. So we need some independent measure that appeals to the content of arguments really to gain traction with the fallacies. And what we've been arguing for the last 15 years is that Bayesian probability provides such a framework for understanding them, and it provides those naturally because the probability calculus is an intentional calculus that attaches to the content of what statements are about, albeit in a reduced form. And just to clarify, because this often, though increasingly less so, raises concerns, the probability calculus from a Bayesian perspective is a way of representing subjective degrees of beliefs, and that applies to any kind of proposition. It's not just about about percentages. It's not just applicable to statements where there are limit frequencies or so on. So it's very general and can be made to apply to statements, such as the fallacies that I've just showed you. It does so in very straightforward ways. So the simple idea, simply is just to think of these arguments as consisting of a conclusion and evidence for that conclusion. In this case, ghosts exist and nobody's proven that they don't. And we can think of our argument strength by using Bayes' theorem, which tells us how to calculate the posterior degree of belief in this conclusion given this piece of evidence. And the simple intuition is that all other things equal, an argument that leads to a greater increase in posterior belief from a given prior will be a stronger argument. And of course, how much you should change your belief is determined by these two key quantities: the likelihood, the probability of obtaining this evidence or argument if the claim is indeed true, and the probability of obtaining this evidence if the claim is indeed false, so-called likelihood ratio. We can also use this likelihood ratio or any other measure of confirmation to extract a prior independent notion of argument strength, if that's useful in a particular analytic context. But in many experimental contexts, this is a very natural way to think about argument strength, because we can simply think of people trying to assess the strength of an argument by thinking hypothetically about how they would feel on receipt of that argument. And that, of course, would also involve, as a starting point, their current prior beliefs about that argument. So the main thing that's happening here by assimilating arguments about facts more generally into this Bayesian framework is that we're sort of intentionally treating arguments as evidence and using the kind of same tools that we have for evidential reasoning for evaluating arguments. So how does this work with an example? Here is an example from an empirical study of an actual experimental scenario that we used, that I'm just going to run you through. So you read a vignette as a participant in our studies that tells you the following. Bill is a police officer in the traffic and accidents department. 2 days ago, a serious accident took place in the region he's responsible for. One of the patients is still in coma. This might be due to an anti-shock medication being given without the initial blood pressure check. That is a standard routine procedure preceding the administration of this drug. He made the necessary investigations in the hospital, interrogating the hospital staff. Bill concludes that blood pressure was measured because the hospital records say it was. And then as a participant, having read that, here simply has to indicate on a scale from 0 to 10, how convincing you think Bill's conclusion is. Now, a participant in a different condition sees the same argument scenario, but a final different conclusion. Bill concludes that blood pressure wasn't measured because the hospital records don't say it was. So this is now an argument from ignorance of the drug or vaccine safety type that I just gave you. And in fact, we use the same scenario with different final sentences to look at 4 different arguments. An affirmative argument where the hospital record says something was checked and the conclusion is that it was indeed checked. Explicit negative evidence. Here, the hospital record explicitly says that blood pressure wasn't checked, and the conclusion is that therefore it wasn't checked. Of course, neither of these are trivial conclusions, given that hospital records could in principle be false, right? The source could be unreliable. And then we have the 2 arguments from ignorance. We have the hospital record doesn't say that it wasn't checked, therefore we assume that it's checked. This is the logical structure of the ghosts example. And then we have, called the same argument, the hospital doesn't say it was checked, therefore we conclude it wasn't checked, which is the vaccine or drug safety example. And each of these just has its own straightforward Bayesian formalization, assuming simply that there are 3 possible states of this hospital record: explicit positive mention, explicit statement that it didn't happen, or no mention of it. So these were participants' responses averaged here for these 4 types of arguments: the positive argument, explicitly positive, explicit negative evidence, and the 2 arguments from ignorance. And what we see is that actually the the argument from ignorance that corresponds to the sort of drug safety, vaccine safety kind of argument is a strong argument in the view of participants in this case. But the analog of the ghosts example is a very poor argument. So we sort of recover the intuition that there's something bad about examples such as the ghost example. But we also designed this study specifically with the following fact in mind. When you think about the logical structure of these different types of arguments, these four arguments, and you think about the probability with which you might receive a positive or a negative report in a particular domain, then it should be the case that we can systematically vary those domains in ways that vary those underlying probabilistic quantities, and we should get different relations between these arguments coming out. So in total, we actually looked at four scenarios that are very different with respect to these properties. So if you think about library catalogs, for example, library catalogs tell you when something is not there. They say the book is on loan. That's one of the fundamental features of it. And that makes it such that for library catalogs, the structural analog of the ghosts example, the catalog doesn't say it's on loan, therefore it's in the library, is in fact a very good argument and stronger than the explicit negative evidence argument. Whereas for railway timetables, right? Railway timetables tell you where something stops. They typically don't tell you where something doesn't stop. So here, the ghosts example, that's logical structure, is terrible. So what we're seeing here is the content specificity, right? So different arguments of the same structure are varying in strength, intuitive strength as a function of the perceived content, the probabilities that are characterized by the underlying world or domain. And they vary not just sort of relative to across different domains, but they vary in relative strength to other arguments over the same domains, right? It's not just that library catalogs are more reliable than hospital records, is that the arguments vary in strength relative to one another. What has this got to do with the Bayesian approach? Well, after providing judgments, we also ask participants to rate explicitly the relevant probabilistic quantities, and we can simply plug those into Bayes' theorem to derive what they should have said, again, averaged over participants here, about the strength of these relative arguments. And we see at least some degree of correspondence between these predicted argument strength ratings and the observed argument strength ratings. And we recover in particular also the differences, systematic differences in pattern across the different argument types. So this is how you can operationalize this account. This is kind of stuff it buys you. That's simple enough, but it already does one of the main things we were looking for, which is that it captures content variation, right? But also, in doing so, it allows us to start to look systematically at the role of type of argument, of logical structure, in conjunction with content variation, right? Because what we're also seeing here through this formalization is systematic variation in the strength of these arguments relative to other types of arguments with different logical structure over the same world, that is, over the same probability distribution. And just to expand on that theme a little bit more, given this formalization that I already mentioned, where we're distinguishing three different types of evidence: explicit positive evidence, explicit negative evidence, and nothing or silence. It also becomes clear that there are at least three different types of arguments from ignorance, which might have seemed fairly similar before trying to engage with this in detail. So the book is in the library because the library doesn't say it's on loan, or the ghost example. Different from the medical test wasn't performed because there's no record in the file. This is the opposites argument. This is the same argument. But there's also James's poor at math, because all his reference letter says is he is punctual and polite. And the thing that's driving here, the inference, is actually the nothing itself. There's no response at all. And these have different formalizations, bring out the difference in structure. And we can see that these different types of argument from ignorance, even defined over the same content, will give rise to systematic differences in strength, which is something we probably wouldn't have been able to capture properly without the formalization tool. So I hope to give you a sort of a first sense that while simple and in many ways intuitive, this formalization does actually allow you to gain a more detailed insight and resolve things more finely in the way that you would want a formalization to be able to do. So this is just one example of this catalog of fallacies. The account has been applied to a whole bunch of other fallacies. We've also argued that it should extend well to the entire catalog, with the exception of a bunch of fallacies which are clearly pragmatic in content. So given that the fallacies do happen in the real world, and they get used in the real world, right? If we legalize gay marriage, next thing people will want to marry their pets is actually a real world argument that came from a group called the American Family Research Institute. So by providing an account of the fallacies, we are already explaining some portion of everyday real world argument. But there's much, much more to argument than just that. So the next obvious question is, can we extend this type of account beyond the fallacies? And I argued in a paper with Jonas Raab in 2016 that this looks incredibly promising because there is a wide literature on argument schemes with very different types of classification schemes that has been developed over many years in the formal argument literature. And we can draw on these schemes, where schemes are things, little structural forms, just like the fallacies, but now for arguments that are putatively good. If we can use that literature and provide probabilistic treatments of those schemes, then we have an account that already captures quite a broad part of everyday informal argument. So in this paper, we tried to demonstrate what that might look like for 3 sample schemes and show how taking a Bayesian formalization to those schemes would actually help fulfill the goal that this scheme-based literature had set itself, which is namely to provide a comprehensive treatment of informal argument that's computationally explicit with a solid normative foundation and useful in education. So with respect to the education part, it's been a critical feature of this scheme-based literature that you don't just identify schemes, but also try to provide critical questions, things to think about that on particular occasion will make arguments of that scheme, instances of that scheme, stronger or weaker. So here's a simple example, the argument from sign. This is probably the most basic scheme of all, and you'll see in a moment why. Motivated student X is late, so there must be a problem with the trains. This is rendered as the argument from sign in the following way. A finding is true in this situation. B is generally indicated as true when it's sign A is true, B is true in this situation. So the structure of this argument is cast as a defeasible modus ponens, where there's a generalization and a particular observation, and the desired conclusion follows from this defeasible modus ponens. Now, this argument is presumptively good, it's defeasible, so there can be exceptions. So we want to know when this argument should hold and when it shouldn't. And critical questions are there to help uncover the quality of these arguments. So the critical questions that Walton et al. Give for this particular scheme are two. First is, what is the strength of the correlation of the sign with the event signified? And two, are there other events that would more reliably account for the sign? And thinking about these critical questions raises a number of issues. First of all, it's clearly the defeasible modus ponens and this generalization, which is supposed to make the argument legitimate. But what exactly is the normative basis for this defeasible modus ponens? Does it simply follow from this generalization? And if yes, don't we have the problem that there are many generalizations that are true that via modus ponens then still give rise to crazy inferences? So if Donald Trump was president, then children like ice cream is undoubtedly true. But reasoning from the Trump presidency to children liking ice cream seems wrong. So is there more required here than just that this defeasible generalization be highly likely to be true or even true? But also, where this correlation can be stronger or weaker, right? Like how reliably this sign A can indicate the conclusion true can vary. How can the strength of that correlation translate to the strength of the inference? Right, so I give an answer to critical question here. What is the strength of the correlation of the sign? And I say, well, it's moderately high. I derive this by modus ponens. Where does the moderately high fit? Do I put it here? So E is moderately indicated as true, or where does it go? Right. And the same with the critical question too, which seems even more problematic. Are there other events that would more reliably account for the sign? What do I do with that? Now, all of these problems, I think, are solved immediately by realizing that the argument from sign is really just like the paradigmatic case of Bayesian inference, right? We can think of A and B and just plug that straight into Bayes' theorem. What we're interested in is what's the probability of B given A, and that's determined by these two quantities, the probability of A given B and the probability of A given not B. And those correspond straightforwardly to these critical questions. So realizing that, we realize that we already have a formal framework for assessing the strength of these, for asking these critical questions, and a computationally explicit procedure for translating our answers to these critical questions into the kind of final assessment of how strong an argument this actually is. So I think Bayesian computation can naturally capture the impact of multiple pieces of evidence, including both pro and con evidence, and gives us an overall summary. So it captures not just critical questions individually, but captures their relative strength and how they interact. And again, that is something you're not going to have fall out of an account that appeals to burdens of proof or some notion of defeat or whatever. These are syntactic notions that require you to evaluate substantively whether or not, given the content, a particular argument should defeat another argument or should meet its burden of proof. So they require some type of content evaluation of the type that this account, the Bayesian account, is providing here in order to really be meaningfully operationalized in the first place. So I don't have time to go through kind of more of these examples, but I think that this account can in principle extend. There's a lot of work to be done here. So this is entirely, promissory, but also on a positive note, I would like to highlight that this work isn't trivial. So for every single one of the fallacies that we've looked at so far in detail, they've turned out to be an interesting analytical universe in their own right, where lots, I felt, was learned by thinking about them in detail. This will surely also be true for these other schemes. So this is a long-term project, one that I think is likely to be both interesting and successful. But what about the normative basis? I've just asked about the normative basis for the feasible modus ponens, and I've said before that we want a normative basis, and that's important also to the scheme-based tradition. And it's clear, given the relationship between is and ought, that we can't just say that something is normative because intuitively it appeals to us. So what we really need is a sort of an independent normative basis for whatever account we're dealing with. And in general, the normative basis for Bayesian probabilistic inference is that that there are sort of instrumental rationality claims that can be fleshed out with respect to decision-making and accuracy norms, such that what you're saying is that if you have this particular goal as a cognitive agent, then you should want to be Bayesian. So to give you an example with respect to accuracy, which is maybe the less familiar because newer strand of this literature, there's been a long tradition of trying to measure the accuracy of probabilistic forecasts, right? So you might want to know how good is your weatherman. One person says it's going to rain today, it's going to rain tomorrow. How accurate are they? How do you calculate that? Well, in that literature, there is a rule that was proposed by Breyer in 1955, which is called the Breyer score, which is simply the squared distance between the assumed and the true value. So on this score, the forecaster says, I think there's a 17% chance of rain today. It then rains. You were off by 30%. So that squared is your error. The Breyer score is a so-called proper scoring rule, which means that if we reward people for their scores on the basis of the Breyer score, they have no incentive to lie or report their predictions as anything other than what they truly believe. And it rewards both resolution and calibration. Resolution is like how many probability levels you distinguish, and calibration is the extent to which your subjective probabilities measure objective probabilities. So that's worth pausing on just for a moment, because you might think, well, it raining tomorrow is a single event. There's no objective probability here. How could I measure that? But in fact, there's a simple trick that's used in this literature and also used in the vast psychological literature on calibration and confidence, which is that you can measure the degree to which somebody's subjective estimates of probability matches objective values by collecting all of the propositions that an agent assigns a particular probability to, putting that in a bin, and then checking which proportion of those items in the bin ultimately turn out to be true. So for those items that I assign a probability of 0.7, 70% of items in that bin should turn out to be true if I'm calibrated and my subjective probabilities match the objective ones. And when they do, I can plot the relationship between subjective and objective probabilities. If I'm calibrated, all of my beliefs lie on this diagonal blue line. If I'm overconfident, then I give more extreme probabilities than objectively merited, a screen function or even the red one. And there's a sizable literature in psychology that has argued extensively about whether people are overconfident and under what circumstances they're overconfident and why. And the thing I just want to pause on is here, why would you want to be calibrated? Why is calibration a good thing? Well, you want to be calibrated because you want to use your probabilities in all likelihood to make decisions. And it's trivial to show that if you're not calibrated, if you're, for example, overconfident, then you will lose out in expected value relative to a calibrated decision maker. That is, you'll get less of what you want if you make decisions on the basis of poorly calibrated probabilities using the maximization of expected value or expected utility. So what's all of this got to do with Bayes? Well, it turns out, as we know from the work of Jonas Raab and Richard Pettigrew, that if you measure accuracy with the prior score, then you want to be Bayesian. The Breyer score uniquely implies probabilism, that is the idea that your beliefs should obey the probability calculus and that you update on the basis of new evidence via Bayes' rule. This will minimize the inaccuracy of your beliefs across all possible worlds that you could entertain as a finite agent who entertains finite worlds. So there's a deep link there, and instrumental rationality claim that so if you want to minimize the accuracy of your beliefs, then you should be Bayesian. Similarly, there are the more familiar Dutch book arguments, right? If you want to avoid bets that you're guaranteed to lose, then you should be Bayesian. If you want to maximize the utility of sampling, then you should be Bayesian. And more pointing here to the type of independent justification, right, that this account can give. There's, I'm sure, more to be said here, and this is still very much an active area of research. But crucially, we're getting from, if you want to maximize the, if you want to minimize the inaccuracy of your beliefs, then you want to be Bayesian as a justification, is completely different from your intuitions about individual arguments, right? So we have a general independent principle that gives you a normative basis. Now, it so happens that much of the time, what that normative basis will tell you is also incredibly intuitive, right? It's often the case that looking at arguments from probabilistic perspective seems almost trivial in formalization terms because it's so intuitive. You think, what is the formalization actually adding, right? And this is already captured in many ways by Laplace, who said famously that the theory of probability is at bottom nothing but common sense reduced to calculus. It enables us to appreciate with exactness that which accurate minds feel with a sort of instinct for which oftentimes they're unable to account. But crucially, there are cases where probability theory shows our intuitions to be incomplete or wrong. And here it's crucial that we have this independent normative justification, because that allows us to accept in those cases where intuitions diverge that the formal framework actually provides the right answer. So I'm going to give you a couple of these examples. So we probably arguably have, as lay people, wrong intuitions about circular arguments. Self-dependent justifications can be perfectly acceptable. You can have probabilistic justifications in finite and infinite loops, as Atkinson and Feinberg showed in a paper in the Notre Dame Journal of Formal Logic in 2010. There are also a whole bunch of argument evaluation rules from the informal argument literature that are shown to be fundamentally flawed from a Bayesian perspective. So in that literature, people have posed rules such as the so-called max-min rule to deal with multiple arguments. So imagine you have a claim and now you have multiple premises, multiple arguments that are supposed to work together in a single overall argument as evidence for that claim. Well, you can have two different situations. One where you have two different independent arguments or pieces of evidence. So say think there's a fire somewhere, and Bob says there's a fire, and James says a fire, and they're completely independently have witnessed this. Or you can have arguments that are connected by an inferential chain. And the max-min rule, drawing on related rules in the literature, such as Theophrastus rule or the chain rule, poses that for the evaluation of these so-called convergent arguments, the strength of the final conclusion should be the strength of the strongest premise. So we're basically ignoring this, the second piece of information, which means that if you have two witnesses telling you that something was the case independently, the max rule is going to treat that just the same as one, which seems wrong, and which Bayes' rule would tell you was wrong. And for chains, the max rule, Bin rule suggests that the strength of the conclusion is the strength of the weakest link, which is also too simplistic. So I'm just going to show you an example. Here's a simple testimony scenario. Imagine you're the manager of a business investigating missing petty cash, trying to determine whether it was stolen or misplaced. During the investigation, your employee Beth says that Alice told her she witnessed some cash being stolen. Alice is currently on leave, therefore you're unable to obtain a statement from her directly. So you've got this chain, right, where Alice saw something, Alice reported that to Beth, and Beth now reports that to you. And the question is, how convinced should you be here? You know both Alice and Beth, and you believe it unlikely that either would falsely be making these claims. In fact, equally unlikely for both. But Alice and Beth now vary in how likely it is that they would make their respective claims if they are in fact true. So given Beth's report, does it matter to your conviction which of the two, Alice or Beth, is more reliable? I'm just going to ask you for a second what your intuition is. Does it matter whether Beth is more reliable than Alice or Alice is more reliable than Beth? And we swap their positions around and have the same general answer? If we can't swap them around and have everything be the same, which configuration leads to the stronger inference? So, show of hands, who thinks it matters what order they're in, where the weakest link is? Who thinks it doesn't matter? Well, here's the normative Bayesian answer. Here it clearly matters what order they're in. So this is Alice, this is Beth, and these are the very low false positive rates for either. And now Alice can be very likely to say what it is about the stolen cash that she saw, or she can be very unlikely to say it. And conversely, the same for Beth. So it can just swap Beth and Alice over. And we can see that this makes a difference systematically to the final probabilities. In contravention of the chain rule, but also in a way that I think goes beyond our basic intuitions without the aid of such a calculus. And in fact, this example stems from a project, a multi-year project that I was involved in, the BARD project, which was trying to provide a Bayesian assistive reasoning tool for ultimately sort of intelligence analysts. And our role in this project was to think about kinds of things that intuitively people get wrong about probabilistic reasoning. So we actually identified a whole bunch of new kind of fallacies or counterintuitive phenomena where people's intuitions are prone to error. So that, I think, is the value of and importance of independent normative justification. So where have we got in the overall scheme of things? Well, I've showed you what you can do with this Bayesian framework, the fallacies. I've argued that it's applicable to a broad range of everyday argument schemes, including to a bunch of schemes that people haven't yet sort of identified and thought about, as we identified in the BARD project. But that's still probably not going to capture all of everyday informal argument. So what do we do with the bit that's left? How do we find out what's there? And for this, I've been engaged in the last few years in a project that tries to look specifically at real world texts and tries to provide analyses of these real world texts. So we kind of take newspaper opinion pieces, such as this piece here that appeared in the UK newspaper, The Telegraph, on why sugar tax is a bad way for tackling obesity. And in this project, we try to then write analyses of the quality of the arguments in that opinion piece. So we're basically trying to see what can be said about sizable chunks of putatively good quality text. These are not bad undergraduate essays, these are published opinion pieces. And looking at real world text and starting from those texts, doing this for long enough should give us a sense of how prevalent or comprehensive argument schemes are and what there might be to say about argument quality beyond individual component schemes. Now, crucially, in this project, our role as analysts is not as a party. We're not just trying to be another person expressing a subjective opinion about sugar tax, but a referee. So we're trying to restrict ourselves to objective criteria. That is criteria that anyone with accuracy goals should be able to subscribe to. And I think the interesting emerging finding in the context of doing this is that this search for objective things you can say about a text and quality gives a sort of central role for inconsistency. But a more general notion of inconsistency than we've arguably grasped, we being research in the past, not just us. So let me illustrate from this sugar tax piece. So early on in the piece, the article says, never mind that such a tax already exists, VAT, that's value added tax. Most food and drink are exempt from VAT, but not sweets, chocolates, sports drinks, and soft drinks. So consumers already pay more for them. Never mind also that the impact of charging even more for such products will be borne by the poorest. And the piece concludes with the following: human beings are shaped not only by what they eat, but also by what they do. And the decline in manufacturing and the rise in office work has contributed to expanding waistbands. The best way for the British to beat the flat is to hit the gym. Now, gyms are many things, but cheap is not one of them. So I hope you'll agree with me that there's at least some degree of tension between, on the one hand, rejecting a sugar tax because it's a tax on the poorest, and on the other hand, arguing that the best way to tackle obesity is by getting people to go to a gym, when clearly the poorest will not even be able to afford to go to the gym, at least under current UK conditions. So I think what that points to me toward is that in order to understand even more of everyday argument, we're going to have to further expand our understanding and formal capturing of different notions of inconsistency. Logical consistency was the bedrock in the heartland, but it didn't go far enough. It didn't go very far at all in the context of informal argument. The probabilistic framework captures more of everyday informal argument because probabilistic coherence is a more general notion of inconsistency. And so the point I want to make, what I want to propose, and of course this is entirely speculative, is to capture the rest, we have to expand our notions, our understanding of inconsistency to capture other further types of inconsistencies, such as inconsistencies between actions, taking one step forward and then one step back, or combinations between probabilistic inconsistency and action inconsistency, and things like that. So in a sense, we've returned, I think, to this idea of the bedrock of argument and the notion of consistency. But I think what we've learned in this journey is that expanding this notion of consistency is what ultimately will give us all of the objective criteria for argument evaluation that we need. And I think that this is because we can intuitively think of inconsistency as the flip side of relevance, right? It's already long been argued that relevance is the central notion in argument and the evaluation of argument quality. An argument is good if it's relevant to a conclusion. It's fallacious if it's irrelevant to a conclusion. And I think there's a general sense in which an argument is relevant if and only if accepting that argument requires some kind of adjustment to the focal belief that it's trying to support. So in conclusion, there are new ways to measure argument quality. I think there's a Bayesian treatment of the majority of fallacies that provides explanation and tools for empirical study. An expansion to a broader set of arguments seems feasible. The underlying quality criteria that are invoked here link to considerations of instrumental rationality. And I think all of this trajectory or arc points to the idea that inconsistency is indeed the fundamental notion constraining the objective of evaluation of arguments. It's just that we need much broader notions of consistency than we've traditionally had, first with classical logic, but then even just with probability calculus as we have it at the moment. And that this notion of inconsistency is at the core of an explicated notion of relevance. So our understanding of norms for real-world arguments is still under development and clearly an ongoing project. But what I feel most strongly about is that what I've presented hopefully gives a sort of discernible shape of what I think in a complete account would look like, and hopefully a useful direction of travel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. Okay, I think Dr. Jonas Raab is already prepared to present some comments on this paper. So Jonas, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen.
Perfect.
Okay. So thanks for the talk. I also enjoyed the paper. What I want to do, though, is to be a bit more critical and basically just quickly say what the bits are I'm gonna criticize and then bring forward 2 short criticisms. Or maybe if you don't want to think of them as criticisms, see them as questions to Ulrike. So the basis of my criticism will be 2 claims. One is that, of course, we are talking about Bayesian argumentation, so Bayes rule, Bayes theorem plays a role. And in particular, it's a rule on revising your beliefs. That is the one piece. The other one is in this quote, namely, one can treat argument evaluation as the hypothetical or actual process of determining how great a belief change an argument brings about, with stronger arguments giving rise to greater change, or other things being equal. So again, what is the point here for me? We're talking about belief change, and it seems like there should be a correlation between the strength of an argument and how much you should change your belief. And I will work with this notion here to say an argument from A to conclusion C is Bayesian good if and only if the premise increases more or less the probability of the conclusion. Okay, so much for the short background. The first criticism regards basically that I think there is a tension between what the Bayesian approach says is a good argument versus arguments which are convincing. And so to take a step back, let's ask what exactly do we do when we argue? And of course, we want to convince someone else of some sort of claim. And in particular, how would we do this? Well, we would probably look at what that person, I called him or her here A, already believes. And we tap into what I call here A's belief set. And intuitively speaking, I think the picture should be that A should be convinced of the conclusion C if we can show that C somehow follows from what A already believes. And I'm not really making any assumptions here. And if you want to, I mean, there would have more to be done to paint a full picture. I think that's the underlying intuition here. And if we bring in more or less the Bayesian side of things and look at more or less a bit more fine-grained distinctions, we can bring forward the idea that someone should be more convinced of a conclusion if we can use premises from their belief set, which are more or less maximal with respect to establishing the conclusion. So I think what we would do and what we should do is to say, look at what A believes. If there is some fine grading done, take the premise which is assigned the highest degree of belief. And indeed, I think then the argument is the better, the stronger the premises are, so to speak. So the more A already believe the premises. But I think the Bayesian approach kind of doesn't really reflect this intuition. On the one hand, there's something, if you do that, I don't say you have to do that, but if you think that your belief set is kind of governed by something like a Lockean thesis, what can happen is that according to the Bayesians, you present a good argument, namely you actually increase the posterior or the probability, let's see, yet you fail to kind of jump a threshold, which might be determined for the agent, him or herself, for what he or she thinks she would actually believe and therefore be convinced of. Going away from Lockean thesis, I think another problem is that the Bayesian approach more or less pushes you towards the weakest premises. And I think from there on, you run into a problem with A, the intuitive picture I just painted before, and B, what I'm gonna say now. Let's look at two arguments which are actually logically valid arguments. So what you should do, or if you update on these premises, what happens is that in both cases, you assign probability 1. So intuitively speaking, you brought forward two logically valid arguments, and it seems like they should be more or less of the same strength. But if you also distinguish between how strongly you take belief A or B, so the premises, it seems like the Bayesian approach would imply that one of these was the better argument. And in particular, it seems like the better one is actually the one where you had less confidence in the premise before. But that just means, or I would argue that intuitively speaking, if you argue from a very weak premise, that should in the end be the worst argument, given that roughly in both cases you present logically valid arguments. Moreover, and that goes back to basically the problem of all evidence, if you are actually doing really well in my intuitive picture and you tap into something that the agent assigns degree of belief 1, then of course we know that you cannot really change the posterior of C, of the conclusion anymore. And hence, in this case, you would more or less rule out logical reasoning as good argumentation. And I think that is, I would not buy into that. As a second criticism, I think partly from what has been said so far, there is some sort of arbitrariness regarding the normative force. And let me put that in this way. So partly to make if you want to brush off the first criticism, what you can point to is to say, yeah, the assumption was all the time that we don't assign extreme probabilities. So let's exclude the cases where we assign degree of belief 0 and degree of belief 1. Again, what happens when we argue still, so taking premises and conclusion to be non-extreme, is that you still need to kind of increase the degree of belief that the conclusion holds. And so what happens now, or I'll phrase it as a question here, so how should A actually change the degree of belief in C? that is the question. So, and of course that will now hopefully, if I'm right, badly for if I'm right for Ulrike, question then whether that can be a good measure for the strength of the argument. So can we say that we should always change the degree of belief in the conclusion then? And it seems like we run into some sort of problem, to put it this way. Partly because now you're kind of forced to conditionalize on something. You have to assign degree of belief 1 to certain propositions suddenly, and that seems to be counterintuitive. That shouldn't happen. And partly you can do that by arguing really, really badly, as I kind of do it here, but in a slightly weird way, because I'm not sure whether there is then in the end a circularity problem, and whether the Bayesian account actually covers that. I think Ulrike has some thoughts on that and has published on that, but I'm not sure that I understand fully the argument. So I put it in this way that it doesn't, at least it's not obviously circular. So, and in the end, that seems like if that's the case, that you should always update after seeing the argument, then you run into the problem of suddenly you have to assign to a lot of propositions a degree of belief 1. And given that I'm a smart arguer, I just let you conditionalize on whatever I want you to believe, and don't really need to care about the argument anymore. So that means we cannot really say we should always conditionalize, yet never seems to conflict with the idea that arguments are about belief change. So given that we've presented an argument and we assigned a strength to the argument, the point should be we should now change somehow how we stand with relation to the conclusion. So never doesn't really do it either, but the other option is then to say, okay, you should do that sometimes, but not always, maybe. And there runs some problems with arbitrariness. There are some problems with whether you actually, if you change some, whether you're still a rational agent, you might just become probabilistically incoherent. And of course, there is a certain problem with circularity, given that you shouldn't just say, okay, the only times you change your degree of belief are when the argument is good, because to some extent we're trying to figure out what even the strength is and whether it's good or not. So that was basically what I had to say for myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas, for your feedback. Ulrike, would you like to respond to at least some of the questions, or?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, Jonas. So I guess I'll take them in order, like the first set of considerations and the second set. I'm not entirely sure I understood your point in the first set, but my sense is that what's going on there is a bit of a sleight of hand, in that you're basically recasting the problem in a different form, and then you're saying the best premise is going to be the premise that has the highest probability in my belief set, right? And then you're trying to show that something weird follows for the Bayesian account. But that's unsurprising if that happens, because that's not the notion of best premise that the Bayesian account is putting forward, right? So if I'm thinking about deduction, if I'm thinking about transmitting probabilities across a deductive inference, right? Deduction is not ampliative. Then it makes sense to start with the strongest things that I have, right? But argument quality for these ampliative arguments that characterize everyday informal argument, i.e. everything I actually talked about, bar the circular argument of God exists because God exists, there what you're doing is you're moving to a conclusion that has strength greater than the premise, right? And the measure of argument, the best argument, is the one that's most diagnostic. That is the one that has the greatest likelihood ratio. And having a large likelihood ratio is not the same as the marginal probability of that evidence being high. They're mathematically related, but they're two completely separate quantities. So I don't understand the overall structure of an argument, if I've understood you correctly, where you basically replace the notion of strong premise with a different one, and then say that that leads to some weird conclusion in the context of the account that's been put forward that doesn't actually have that notion of premise quality or strength in the first place.
Sorry, I guess you're waiting for me to say something.
Yes.
So what I was getting at is just, to some extent, you motivate your account also by saying, in the end, we want to be convinced of the right things and so on. And I think that bit would then still be missing in your account. And I'm not sure that, to some extent, some relevance in these arguments might still be possible. It's just there are certain cases where I would say, okay, this is actually how whatever framework you kind of come up with to measure how good or bad an argument was, I would say these should count as good. And to some extent, I think you're right insofar as I would see my criticism to some extent as begging the question against you. But I would stand my ground insofar as to say, I think my intuitive picture should be the correct one, partly also by looking at how we do argue. I mean, I'm not just gonna convince you of something without any sort of idea what sort of premises I should use, but I'm gonna check with you where I'm on relatively safe ground. And from that picture, I think more or less my intuitive picture emerges, and I'm not sure whether the Bayesian account
right. So,
captures that.
okay, so yeah, so that gets to the second point and the reply to the second point, right? Like, I still don't think that even what you've just said there is going to uniquely identify as strong premises the ones you want to call strong premises, because the point about convincing somebody is you're trying to change their belief, right? You're not trying to transmit a probability, you're trying to change a degree of belief, right? And a premise just having a high degree of belief at present is not sufficient. You can't look at the marginal probability. You need to look at the diagnosticity, the likelihood ratio. That's the whole thing that makes this Bayesian account work with all of the arguments I gave you. And it's the thing that's missing in any logical, classic or non-classical treatment that I'm aware of that you could apply to them, right? So it's not just like you're mischaracterizing a small bit of the machinery. It's like missing the kind of main feature, I guess. But the second point, right, is your point about convincingness and good argument, right? So I think there are interesting questions there. I agree with you, but I think the first thing I want to say is something kind of quite deflationary, right, is that the way I've presented this account to you is as a kind of local measure of argument quality that captures a relation between a piece of premise material and a piece of a conclusion, right? I've not spoken about everything else an agent believes or how an agent should actually fix their beliefs and what an agent should actually at the end of the day believe. Now, it would be nice if there was such a theory that told me exactly what I need to believe about everything and how to make my beliefs coherent at any point in time, but I agree with you that there isn't presently such a theory. But because there presently isn't such a theory, I think that's also a strange charge to put against this measure of argument quality. Right? It seems to me you're asking for something that presently doesn't exist on any account of argumentation or any account of anything and saying, you can't do that. So somehow you're deficient as an account of the thing that you are actually trying to do, which is elucidate a local relationship between premises and conclusions. Right? Or to put that differently, if I think about classical logic, right? What classical logic tells me is that certain conclusions follow from certain premises. It doesn't tell me what I'm supposed to believe. It's a contingent, it's a statement about the connection between different statements. It doesn't even tell me what to believe if I believe the premise to be true, strictly speaking, because I might have other beliefs that the conclusion now renders me inconsistent with. So I'm going to have to fix something somewhere in my belief system. And logic doesn't say what I have to fix. And it's never said that, right? We simply don't have theories about how to fix all of our beliefs. And this isn't trying to be such a theory. It would be great if we had one, and we want to move toward building one. But I think that's a bit like sort of saying, you're, I've introduced you to a Model T Ford, which goes a lot faster and further than a horse-drawn carriage. And now you're saying, well, it's not as fast as a rocket to the moon at a point in time when we have no rockets to the moon, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm okay with that. I'm not sure that I would have to think about it at some point in more detail. I'm not entirely sure I understand the full picture entirely, but I guess that's okay.
So let me try one more way. So for example, the problem of old evidence is an interesting and important one, right? But it's an interesting and important argument when I'm trying to think about how I should actually change my beliefs, right? It's neither here nor there of whether evidence is known or not. If I'm just trying to evaluate a local relationship between a piece of evidence and a conclusion, right? Because I can just ask myself, if I hypothetically learn this thing, right, what would follow for the conclusion? It's a hypothetical assessment. And that's distinct from everything and anything about my actual beliefs.
Yeah, what I would wonder still is, why do all these arguments then count as not good? I mean, I understand that you want to change the belief, but to some extent, I think part of the problem might actually be the Bayesian assumption, the background that you already have kind of more or less assigned so many degrees of belief, but there might, in real life, I might just not have thought about it or even entertain any sort of proposition, and then kind of assign or become or make that more or less coherent with what else I already believe. But that doesn't seem to be a part of the Bayesian picture where you're kind of supposed to assign probabilities to everything that's already out there.
But I'm just talking about an algebra, right, where I'm entertaining the minimal set of things that are required to express the problem. I'm not talking about all of my beliefs, right?
True, but still, I mean, at that point, it seems like, to me still, I would want that logical inferences from true premises should count as good arguments. And from what I know
but
about
God exists, but God exists because God exists is not a good argument, right?
I'm not saying it's a good argument per se, because one bit is missing, namely the key information. Why should I believe the premise? I think that's the reason why circular arguments are bad. We want some sort of evidence for the conclusion, and that needs to be non-trivially different from what the conclusion is. Whereas if I come up with a different argument from true premises and conclude and establish that God exists, I think that would be a great argument.
But a lot of deductively valid argument has exactly that quality, that the conclusion, in a sense, contains the premises and vice versa, which is why it's deductively valid. So this is not like a pathological feature of an exceptional example. It's going to be true of vast proportions of deductive arguments, that I can't know the premises without knowing the conclusions, because they're contained in one another, which is why it fails. Yeah, that's exactly
I'm not saying that all of them will be great arguments.
But that's exactly the heart of why logic fails to capture these everyday inferences, which are typically ampliative. They're uncertain inferences.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I'm not saying that go back to logic and that's all you need. And I'm also not saying logic is not unproblematic for reasons you pointed out. But at least some of these logically valid arguments, I contend, should be good arguments.
Yeah, there will be some, but the vast majority of them will not be good arguments in the sense that we're talking about here.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for this interesting exchange. I would proceed to the general discussion. So please, anyone who is interested in posing a question, either raise a hand or type a Q into the chat. Yes, Danila Glavaničová.
Thanks. That was very interesting. I had a question on the gym example. Well, it's two questions actually. So one question is whether or what kind of inconsistency is detected in this sort of example. And the second question is what happens to the argument after one discovers such an inconsistency. What I mean is that, for instance, I can see that it's very easy to substitute for the gym just exercise, and in that case it's not such an expensive thing to do, because one can do that at home and at the streets. One can go for a run, one can exercise at home. So I see there's an easy remedy for the argument, but I would be interested in in this formal approach, like what's the outcome after you discover such an inconsistency.
So two questions, I guess. Yeah. So the argument didn't say exercise; it said go to the gym, right? And so of course there is always an issue there with respect to characterizing any kind of natural language argument, whether you've appropriately rendered the argument or not, and how far you're supposed to kind of go in rendering this consistent. But I think even if you said, exercise, I think some of the same concerns would obtain, right? Because if you look at the people who are going to struggle to go to the gym might well also be people who struggle to find the time to exercise, right? Given the precarious nature of their living conditions. With respect to, formally characterizing that inconsistency, I'm not doing more at this point than appealing to your intuition that somehow these things don't go together, right? Like, to me, they don't really go together. And the whole interest is in trying to work out more formally how they don't go together. And if I had solved that problem already, then I would have spoken about it. And I haven't. I have thoughts about it, but I think that's an interesting problem that I just kind of want to put out there for people to think about, who might have have other ideas and other frameworks too that might be suitable for capturing these broader types of inconsistencies that I might not even know about. I think just and one other context, if you didn't find that example compelling, I was really struck by the sort of thing about the broader notions of inconsistency really started to dawn on me when I started to pay attention a lot to how people argue in online comments on social media, where actually people contradict themselves all the time, which was interesting to me because I first got interested in logic as a law student, where I was looking for some kind of firm ground. And then it was really depressing to discover that logic had so little to say about legal argument, because basically people didn't contradict themselves in the way that classical logic assumes, right? It has no normative purchase because people don't make those kinds of errors. And they're not making those kinds of errors in online debate either, but yet there's a lot of stuff there that feels contradictory, right? They apply uneven standards of evaluation, they cherry pick stuff, and so I think the project there is to try to elucidate those types of inconsistencies in some formal framework. And I think it's in part then about what that formal framework says that would allow us to draw the conclusions about which of these are worse or better and what exactly you should do about them. I don't know if that helps at all with your.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, if I can just add, I didn't mean to like attack the example.
No.
I'm totally persuaded by the example that that it works and that it shows that there's some sort of inconsistency between the two. And I only think it's interesting also in connection to what our department wants to do in the future, because we want to focus on conditionals that can have normative consequence. So in connection to this, I think it's very, very interesting.
Yeah. So I think so there's like all these interesting things where people propose rules and then in discourse, for example, and then violate those self-same discourse rules. Right, there's interesting tensions between what somebody actually does and says should be done. And there's a whole bunch of these kinds of tensions, all of which I think are directly relevant to argument quality in ways that haven't really been grasped yet.
Yeah, thank you. Further questions? I don't see any questions. So maybe meanwhile, I have a question. I'm very sympathetic with your work and today's talk, but I was wondering what does Bayesian framework tells us about the situation when you have at least two Bayesian agents who differ at least to their priors or to their likelihoods in some argument structure, because as long as they are coherent in their set of degrees of belief, they should end up by some posterior, which is okay in Bayesian setting. But in case one posterior is quite different from another agent's posterior, I'm wondering if there is still some need. Is there some room for some more objective criteria or some further constraints which would show in what sense the normative strength or weakness of one of those two arguments depends on?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, and it starts to get back to, I think, issues that Jonas raised and that were raised by Jonas's points. So first of all, that the simple answer is yes, of course. This account of strength is relative to what you believe about the likelihoods. So I can think of an argument as strong that you can think of as weak if I just have the right beliefs about the likelihoods, right? And so some degree of relativism is built into this. And the question is that too much relativism or too little relativism, right? Like if you're coming from the rhetoric literature or the informal argument literature, it's always been a historical point of departure that arguments are kind of audience relative, right? And that they can vary depending on the audience. I think I'm inclined partly because I think there's a sort of quite compelling independent normative foundation for Bayesianism, right? To sort of think that relativism is probably appropriate, that amount of relativism, and that relates back to inconsistency, what I was saying about inconsistency, that I think at the end of the day, we can obtain some degree of correspondence in the world via coherence, but I can't tell you what to actually believe, right? And I think with respect to it seeming too relativistic, right? There is then always the question that you can ask is whether somebody actually genuinely has those beliefs, rationally assigns those likelihoods. right? So is it really, and I think for a lot of cases in everyday argument where you'd want to say something, where somebody has radically different beliefs about evaluating evidence, if we think something like, you know, think about stuff like the pandemic, right? That it's caused by 5G mobile phone signals, right? I think the problem with those beliefs probably is that once you start to really unpack them, it would be hard to see that all of the evidential bases for that would be genuinely consistent with what people believed otherwise about the world. But I think that's ultimately the only route you have to go. But there's another interesting point raised by yours, which I think gets back to Jonas and what I said in response to Jonas's comments, is that I've presented this at the moment as an account that talks about a local measure of strength, right, between and captures an argument, a premise conclusion relationship. And I think it does that with kind of, you know, with reasonable success, but I might think about good argument or compelling argument from a broader perspective, right? So like Jonas was doing, I might say, well, I want to take into account more fully the range of different things you believe and capitalize on that. And there it might be that, let's call that, to distinguish it from the local thing, let's call that effective argument, right? There it might be, for example, that the best argument isn't that the most effective argument isn't the strongest argument, given what else you believe. But there's a further wrinkle there that, of course, in most real dialectical contexts, we might not just assign different likelihoods, we might have a completely different set of propositions. So we even have sort of these non-commensurate algebras to start with. And I do think that, and there are people like Stefan Hartmann who are sort of working on, you know, transitions between expanding the algebra and whatever, that hopefully one can make progress with these kinds of questions. And we have some projects running at the moment that start to go into that direction. And I think one would want to be able to say something about that, but none of the stuff that I've showed you in and of itself allows you to address those issues.
Okay, thanks for this explanation. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm sorry, it seems that we are quite out of time. So let me again thank you very much to Ulrike's talk and also to Jonas' comments. And if you allow me to have a 5-minute break, we could meet in 5 minutes. Okay. Thanks a lot.